Welcome to Tales of Wild West. The forest was still except for the brittle whisper of wind moving through the pines. Frost clung to every needle, silvering the branches in the half-light of a fading afternoon. She sat on a fallen log, shawl drawn tight, her breath ghosting into the cold. Beside her lay a bundle tied in a worn kerchief, all she had been allowed to keep. The wagon tracks were already fading under a drift of dry needles, the ruts softening, as if the world itself wished to erase the memory of her family's departure. They hadn't looked back. Not once. She stared at the emptiness where they had been, waiting for her chest to feel something other than the dull ache pressing under her ribs. She'd known this was coming. For months she had felt herself sliding toward it, step by step, day by day, as surely as an autumn leaf falls from its stem. A woman who could not give children was a woman without purpose in their eyes, a mouth to feed, a burden with no promise of legacy. The words had been whispered around fires, in low conversations when they thought she was asleep. And now they had put their whispers into action. She pressed her hands together inside her shawl, fingers stiff with cold. It was strange, she was afraid, yes, but not in the way she had imagined. No wild creature lurked yet in the shadows. No snow threatened to bury her. The greater terror was that she might sit here forever and no one would know she had been alive at all. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. Far off, she thought she heard the dull rhythm of an axe striking wood. She closed her eyes, listening, wondering if the sound was real or a trick of wind. When she opened them again, she felt smaller beneath the towering pines. The light was thinning, the sky turning a color between pewter and smoke. She thought of the morning they left. Her sister had been the one to tell her to climb down from the wagon. The words were calm, almost kind, as though this were some mutual decision they'd reached. Her father's eyes had stayed on the horse's ears. No one had hugged her. No one had wished her well. She had stepped into the frost as though stepping into exile. A shiver crept over her, and she hunched deeper into her shawl. She told herself she would wait until full dark, then begin walking toward the sound of the axe. If it was a man, perhaps he might take pity. Or perhaps not. Pity was not something she counted on anymore. Then she heard it, laughter. High, clear, and utterly out of place in the cold hush. She turned toward the sound, her heart lifting and tightening all at once. Between two great fir trunks, movement flickered, a flash of red wool, the scuff of boots on frozen ground. A child stepped into view. He was perhaps 8, cheeks ruddy, hair sticking in wild directions beneath a knit cap. He carried a bundle of kindling strapped with twine, dragging slightly behind him. When his eyes found her, he stopped short but did not run. Instead, he regarded her with the same open curiosity one might give to an unexpected animal, not fear, not yet trust. Another form appeared, a girl, perhaps 2 years older, with a braid thick as rope swinging over her shoulder. Her boots were worn at the toes, and she clutched a half-filled basket. She tilted her head as if weighing the moment. The boy broke the silence first. "You lost?" She could not summon words. Her lips parted, but the answer, any answer, seemed too heavy to carry into the air. The girl stepped closer, squinting at her bundle. "You look cold," she said. She reached into her basket and brought out an apple, its skin dulled from storage but still sound. She held it out, arms steady. The woman hesitated, then took it, feeling the faint warmth from the girl's hand. The taste was sharp and sweet against her tongue, and it startled her how quickly she realized she had been hungry. "Pa's cabin's not far," the boy said. "We're bringing in wood before the light's gone." He glanced toward the trees, then back at her. "You could come." The girl gave a small nod, as if sealing the invitation. She rose slowly, legs stiff, the bundle light in her hand. They set off through the trees, and she followed, the crunch of frost beneath their boots the only sound. The scent of smoke began to weave into the air, growing stronger with each step. The cabin appeared suddenly between the trunks, a squat structure of hand-hewn logs, its roof furred with moss and a wisp of chimney smoke curling upward. The windows glowed faintly, gold against the deepening blue of dusk. The children went inside ahead of her, calling, "Pa!" A man emerged from the shadows of the doorway. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, the kind of strength that came from long days at the axe. His beard was the color of worn bark, his eyes a muted gray that took her in quietly. The boy pointed back toward her. Found her in the wood. The man's gaze lingered, not sharp but steady. Come in, he said, voice low, unhurried. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pine and something cooking on the stove. She set her bundle near the door. The man gestured toward a chair by the small table. She sat, hands folded in her lap, feeling the strange weight of being seen but not interrogated. The girl placed a bowl before her, steam rising from a broth studded with root vegetables. She murmured thanks and began to eat, the warmth working through her fingers and into her chest. The man sat opposite her, elbows resting on his knees. Snow comes soon, he said. Not safe to be out in the forest after sundown. She nodded. Her throat felt thick. The boy leaned against his father's side, still watching her as if she might vanish. She took another spoonful, letting it linger in her mouth, and in that moment, a truth settled over her. She had stepped out of one kind of wilderness into another. And though this one was gentler, warmer, she could not yet tell if it would keep her. The man's gaze softened just enough to make her chest ache. Stay the night, he said. Sort the rest come morning. The girl smiled faintly, as if she had known all along that this would be the answer. And yet, beneath the hum of the stove and the muted creak of the cabin settling, she felt a stir of unease. She did not know this man, this place, or why fate had led her to the children's laughter in the trees. Outside, the wind rose, scattering needles across the frozen ground. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, the forest kept its secrets. And for all the warmth in the room, she could not shake the thought that she was stepping into a story she did not yet understand. The morning light came pale and slow through the cabin windows, laying soft stripes across the worn plank floor. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and bread warming on the hearth, the faint sounds of children's chatter carrying from somewhere near the door. For a moment she lay still, uncertain if she had dreamed her way into this place. Then the murmur of a deep voice joined the smaller ones, steady and low, and the sound seemed to anchor her. She rose from the cot the girl had shown her to the night before, folding the quilt neatly, as if the small act might prove she was worth the trouble of keeping. Her bundle waited where she'd left it, tied shut and unimpressive, the sum of a life shrunk into cloth and string. She kept her eyes from it. The children were already bundled in coats, preparing to step outside. The boy, bright-eyed despite the chill, grinned at her. Pa says you can help us if you want. We're going to fetch more wood. His sister glanced over her shoulder at their father, who stood near the door fastening his thick jacket. The lumberjack's gaze found her with quiet intent. It'll warm you, he said simply, as though that were enough explanation. They set out into the crisp morning, boots sinking into frost-hardened earth. The forest was different in daylight. Less a place of threat, more a cathedral of green and shadow. She breathed deep, letting the air fill her chest until it almost hurt. The boy darted ahead, kicking through drifts of fallen needles, while the girl stayed closer, humming under her breath. The man walked beside her without hurry, carrying a broad-headed axe over one shoulder. He asked no questions, and somehow that was more merciful than kindness. Now and again, he stooped to clear a branch from the path, his movements practiced and unthinking. They reached a small clearing where stumps marked the work of years past. He set to chopping without preamble, each swing sure and deliberate. The sound cracked through the cold air, rhythmic as a drum. The children gathered fallen limbs, stacking them with method beyond their years. She bent to help, the bark cold and rough under her fingers. As she worked, her thoughts drifted. She had been taught all her life that a woman's worth was measured in the children she bore, the lineage she carried forward. Without that, she had been deemed a hollow tree, still standing, perhaps, but no longer alive in the ways that mattered. Here, gathering firewood, she felt the faintest challenge to that verdict. The work was humble, but it fed a need older than shame, to be useful. When the last of the wood was bundled, they started back toward the cabin. The boy chattered about a fox he'd seen near the creek, the girl warning him not to wander too far. The man listened without comment, his expression unreadable but his presence undeniably solid. Inside again, the warmth wrapped around them. The girl set the bread on the table, the boy clattering about with tin cups. The man stowed the axe and leaned briefly against the wall, as though measuring the room with his stillness. She could feel his eyes on her now and then, not in judgment but in the way one might watch a wild bird deciding whether to stay. After the meal, she offered to mend a torn sleeve on the boy's coat. The girl brought her a sewing tin, its contents rattling like loose teeth. She threaded the needle with slow care, her hands remembering the motions even as her mind drifted to winters past. The boy sat beside her, watching intently, his small elbow warm against her arm. "You sew like Ma used to," he said without looking up. The words caught her off guard. She did not know how to answer, so she only smiled faintly and tied off the thread. That afternoon, she swept the cabin's floor, careful to push the dirt toward the door rather than scatter it. The children played nearby, building forts from stacked kindling, their laughter filling the air in bright spurts. Each sound pressed against her heart in a way she could not name. When the sun dipped low, the man returned from checking his traps. He set a small brace of rabbits on the table, then began to clean them with the same quiet efficiency he gave every task. She watched from her place by the fire, noting how his hands were both strong and precise. Later, as the stew simmered, he sat across from her. The lamplight caught in the lines at the corners of his eyes. "You plan to stay long?" The question was asked without pressure, but it seemed to open a door she wasn't ready to walk through. "I hadn't thought far ahead," she said truthfully. "I'm not sure where else to go." His gaze held hers a moment longer, then he nodded once, as though that settled it. "Best you rest here for now. Work enough for one more pair of hands." She wanted to thank him, but the words felt fragile in her throat. Instead, she busied herself with the stew, adding salt, stirring slowly. The children slipped between them with bowls and spoons, oblivious to the quiet current passing across the table. That night, after the dishes were stacked and the fire banked low, she sat alone for a while, listening to the wind outside. The cabin creaked softly, its timbers settling like an old man in a chair. She traced the grain of the table beneath her fingertips, thinking how easily this small space had begun to feel like shelter. And yet, beneath that shelter, a doubt persisted. She had been taken in before, briefly, reluctantly, and the welcome had always worn thin. This man had not asked for her history, but she knew it would find its way to him. And when it did, the truth would sound the same as it always had, barren, unfit, unneeded. She looked toward the closed door of the children's room, their quiet breathing just audible. A strange ache pressed in her chest, sharper than the cold. She could not say if it was longing or fear. The man stepped from the shadows near the hearth, his presence filling the room without noise. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll bring in more wood before the snow." His tone carried no assumption, yet she understood it as a kind of invitation. She nodded. "I'll be ready." His eyes lingered on her a fraction longer than needed. Then he turned away, the floorboards groaning under his weight. She listened to his steps fade into the other room, the sound swallowed by the cabin's stillness. The fire cracked once, sharp in the quiet. She drew her shawl tighter and stared into the embers until her vision blurred. Somewhere in that glow was the shape of a life she could almost imagine, one not handed to her by blood or bound by expectation, but built by choice. But choice, she knew, was a fragile thing. And as the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, she could not help but wonder how long this one would hold. The days began to fold into one another like pages turned with care. Mornings brought the sound of the axe splitting the frozen air, the children's boots scuffing against the packed snow, the scent of coffee and pine resin drifting through the cabin. She moved through these hours quietly, taking up small labors without being asked, sweeping the hearth, patching worn shirts, keeping the bread from burning. Each task felt like a stitch in something fragile but growing, a fabric that might one day hold her if she dared believe in it. The children seemed to accept her as if she had always been there. The boy followed her from room to room, bringing her twigs he claimed were good luck charms, each with a crooked smile. The girl, cautious at first, now sought her counsel on braiding hair or seasoning stew. These were small things, but they pressed deep against a hollow inside her she had thought would never fill. The lumberjack spoke little, yet his silences were never empty. When she handed him his mended coat, he studied the evenness of the stitches with a quiet nod before slipping it on. When she ladled stew into his bowl, he gave a wordless hum of approval. At first she mistook this for mere politeness. But there were moments, a glance that lingered, the faint easing of his shoulders when she entered the room, that suggested a recognition, unspoken but steady. One evening, after the children had drifted into sleep, she lingered at the table with her sewing. The lamplight pooled across the wood, casting his shadow long on the wall. He was whittling something by the fire, the scrape of blade against wood keeping time with the ticking clock. "You're quiet tonight," he said at last, not looking up. "I'm still learning what belongs to me here," she answered. The truth slipped out before she could dress it in safer words. His knife paused mid-stroke. "And what do you reckon that is?" She hesitated, pulling her thread taut. "A place at the table. A reason to stay. Things I've not been given before." He returned to his carving, but the corner of his mouth bent in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You've been giving more than you've taken." The remark settled over her like the weight of a blanket, warm and heavy. She worked in silence after that, but her stitches felt sure. As winter deepened, the cabin became a world of its own. Snow sealed the roof in white drifts piling high against the walls. The wind's voice turned sharper, threading through the pines in long, mournful notes. They spent more hours indoors, and in those hours she began to notice the small ways they moved as a family, the children leaning into him without hesitation, his broad hands settling on their shoulders, the easy rhythm of their voices overlapping. She found herself drawn into that rhythm without meaning to, speaking in we instead of I. Still, a shadow followed her, the old fear that once her usefulness was measured and found wanting, the warmth would vanish. She caught herself watching the lumberjack's face for any sign that her place here was temporary. Some nights, she lay awake in the loft space above, listening to the breathing of the household, steady as the ticking clock, wondering if she was daring too much by letting her guard lower. It was the girl who pierced that unease one late afternoon. They were shelling beans together when the child, without looking up, said, "Pa doesn't talk about Ma much, but I think he likes you here." Her hands stilled over the bowl. "That's kind of you to say." "It's true," the girl insisted, pushing a shell toward her. "The house is lighter when you're in it." She didn't know how to answer. So she smiled softly and set the empty pot aside, her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The boy burst in just then, cheeks red from the cold, holding a scrap of birch bark scrawled with something in charcoal. "For you," he said, pressing it into her hand. The drawing was crude, a stick figure with long hair standing beside two smaller ones and a tall, square-shouldered man. All four held hands. Her breath caught. She traced the faint lines, afraid the marks would smudge beneath her touch. Dinner that night tasted different, though the stew was the same. She caught herself glancing toward the lumberjack, wondering if he knew the picture existed. He didn't mention it, but once, as she refilled his cup, their eyes met in a quiet exchange that made the room feel warmer than the fire. A week later, a thaw came briefly, softening the snow. She and the children walked to the creek's edge, where water gurgled under thin ice. They threw pebbles into the breaks, watching the ripples spread. The boy asked if she would still be here when spring came. The question struck her harder than the wind. She told him she hoped so. When they returned, she found the lumberjack splitting wood outside. His sleeves were rolled, breath misting the air. She lingered near the porch, watching the clean arc of each swing, the sure placement of each log. He looked up after a time, resting the axe's handle against his shoulder. "Children like you," he said simply. "They've been kind to me," she replied, tucking a strand of hair into her scarf. "They see things plain. Don't reckon they'd ask you to stay if they didn't mean it." The words came so matter-of-fact that she nearly missed their weight. She murmured something about being grateful, but his gaze stayed on her, steady and unreadable. That night, after the children were in bed, he set a small wrapped bundle in front of her. "Thought you could use this," he said. Inside was a pair of knitted mittens, thick and warm. The yarn was the deep green of pine needles. She ran her fingers over the stitches. "They're beautiful." He shrugged. "Winter's not done yet." There was no grand gesture in his voice, no attempt at sentiment, but she felt the truth of it all the same. Her throat tightened as she pulled them on. Later, as she stood by the window, she caught his reflection in the glass. He was looking her way, though when she turned, he busied himself with the fire. The sense of being quietly watched, not for weakness, but for belonging, stayed with her. She went to bed that night with the mittens folded beneath her pillow, as though their nearness might anchor her to this place. Sleep came slowly, her mind drifting between what was and what might be. She could see herself in spring, hanging laundry on a line strung between pines, calling the children in for supper, hearing his boots on the porch. It was almost enough to believe. But as the wind rattled the shutters and the moonlight spilled pale across the floorboards, a thought rose unbidden. Nothing this steady had ever lasted for her. And somewhere beyond the warm circle of the cabin's walls, the world that had cast her aside was still out there, waiting, perhaps, to find her again. The snow had thickened overnight, draping the forest in a quiet that felt almost holy. She stood at the window, breath clouding the glass, watching the flakes tumble in lazy spirals. Inside, the cabin was still, the children asleep, the lumberjack outside splitting the day's first wood. It might have been any winter morning, but a heaviness had begun to coil in her chest, the kind that warns of something drawing near. It came in the form of a knock. Not the firm, familiar rap of the lumberjack returning, but a sharper sound, quick and impatient. She opened the door to find a man swaddled in a heavy coat, scarf wound high against his face. His eyes flicked over her, then past her shoulder into the cabin. "You're Joseph Harrow's sister, ain't you?" His voice was thin and edged, carrying a trace of disbelief. Her stomach tightened. She had not heard her brother's name spoken in weeks. "I was," she said carefully. "They're in town," the man went on, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Talking about you. Saying you've gone and taken up with a widower in the woods. Shameful, they're calling it." The words dropped like stones between them. She could feel the air shift in her lungs. The man didn't linger. "Figured you ought to know. Not my business what you do, but tongues are wagging." With that, he turned and disappeared into the white. She shut the door and stood for a moment, palms pressed against the wood as if to keep the cold and the gossip both on the other side. The warmth of the cabin felt suddenly fragile, like it could crack and spill away at the lightest touch. When the lumberjack came in, stamping snow from his boots, she had already begun gathering her few belongings into the bundle. His eyes caught the motion. "Going somewhere?" Her throat closed around the answer. "I can't stay," she managed. "They'll ruin your name same as they ruined mine." He took off his gloves slowly, setting them on the table. "Who will?" "My family. The town. They're saying things. They always do. And once the words start, they don't stop until everything's been taken from you." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her bundle. "You think I've got a name so fine it can't stand a little talk?" "It's not little talk," she said, the words breaking sharper than she meant. "It's poison. It seeps into every hand that shakes yours, every look that meets your eye. I won't do that to you. Or to the children." The children. She could hear them stirring in the loft above, their voices soft and blurred with sleep. She gripped the edge of the table, holding herself still. "You belong here," he said. His voice was low but certain. "I belong nowhere," she whispered before she could stop herself. Something in his gaze shifted, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned toward the stove, stoking the fire with deliberate care, as though grounding himself in the work. The sound of the iron poker against the grate filled the silence between them. The day passed in a muted haze. She kept to the smaller tasks, washing dishes, folding the mended clothes, but every movement felt like a farewell. The children noticed. They followed her more closely than usual, the boy slipping his hand into hers when she passed. The girl watched her with a narrowed gaze, as if she could see the shape of what was coming. By late afternoon, The wind had risen, rattling the cabin walls. She found herself alone with the children while the lumberjack went to check the traps. The girl finally spoke. "You're leaving." She opened her mouth to deny it, but the truth was a weight too heavy to shift. She only said, "It might be better for everyone." The girl's voice wavered. "Not for us." She took her hand then, holding it with a firmness that made the woman's heart ache. "You're our ma now." The boy, hearing this, came and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Don't go," he mumbled into her shawl. Her knees weakened, and she sank to the floor with them, one arm around each small body. Their warmth seeped into her, undoing the neat knot of resolve she had been tying all day. She rested her cheek against the girl's hair and closed her eyes. The door opened with a gust of cold, and the lumberjack stepped inside. Snow clung to his shoulders, the fur of his collar crusted white. He took in the sight of them on the floor, the children clinging, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Still thinking of running?" he asked, his voice even. She straightened, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door." He shrugged off his coat, hanging it on the peg. "Trouble finds its way here no matter who's inside." He paused, then added, "Difference is, some trouble's worth the keeping." She felt the children's arms tighten around her. "I'm not worth." "You are," he said, cutting her off. "More than you know. And I'll not have anyone telling you different, least of all you." The words hit with the force of something she had never been given, choice, without condition. She wanted to believe him. That night, after the children were in bed, he spoke again, softer now. "Your past isn't mine to carry, but I'll carry you if you'll let me." Her hands trembled in her lap. She didn't trust herself to answer. He didn't press. Only banked the fire and wished her good night, the weight of his promise settling over the room like another quilt. She lay awake long after the cabin fell silent, the children's breathing above her steady and deep. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, but inside, the words he'd spoken glowed like embers in the dark. Still, she knew the world beyond these walls had long arms and sharper teeth. And even as warmth curled through her at his defense, a question rose like a shadow in the flicker of the fire: how long before it reached for her again? Winter settled deep, thick as a held breath. The snow outside rose high against the cabin walls, muffling the world into a kind of hush that felt almost protective. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of pine logs burning slow, their smoke curling up the chimney into the gray sky. She moved through the days with a rhythm that had grown almost natural, tending the fire, mending small tears in the children's clothes, helping with the stew. The unease that had gnawed at her since the knock on the door had not vanished, but it no longer sat in her chest like an iron weight. The children were her constant shadow. The boy followed her to the woodpile, eager to carry even the smallest logs. The girl lingered at her side in the kitchen, offering to stir the pot or fetch the salt. Sometimes she caught them looking at her with a kind of quiet certainty, as though they had already decided she belonged to them. The lumberjack never spoke again of her leaving. But his eyes seemed to read her every thought, steady and unflinching. She caught him watching once as she brushed the girl's hair, the faintest shift in his expression telling her he was memorizing the moment. It made her hands tremble, but she kept brushing, long, slow strokes until the braid lay neat against the child's back. One evening, when the wind outside rattled the shutters and the firelight pooled across the floor, he set his mug down and spoke. "I don't keep people by force. But I don't let them walk away because someone else says they ought to." She didn't answer. Words, she had learned, could be traps. But the children were listening from the hearth, their eyes bright, as though waiting for her to say the thing they most wanted to hear. She only smiled faintly and went back to her sewing. The next morning dawned clear and bitter. The forest stood heavy under its white burden, branches bending low. He asked her to walk with him to check the traps along the creek. She hesitated, the cold cut like a blade outside, but something in his voice carried the weight of an unspoken need. She wrapped herself in her shawl and followed. They walked in silence, their boots sinking deep into the snow. The air was so sharp it stung her lungs, the sound of their breathing loud in the stillness. The creek ran slow beneath a crust of ice, its dark water flashing here and there in the morning light. He crouched to lift the first trap, empty save for a scattering of frozen leaves. "Some winters are harder than others," he said without looking up. She thought he spoke of the traps, but then he glanced at her, and she saw he meant something larger. She knelt beside him, brushing the ice from the chain. "And some people," she said, "don't survive them." His gaze held hers a long moment. "You have." They finished the work in companionable quiet, the words between them lingering like the smoke of a just doused flame. On the way back, the boy's drawing, the one of 4 stick figures holding hands, returned to her mind. She wondered if he had told his father about it. She wondered if it mattered. That evening, the children coaxed her into telling a story before bed. She chose one her mother had told her long ago, of a tree that could not bear fruit but gave shelter to every bird in the forest. The girl leaned against her arm, the boy curled at her side. When she reached the end, both were quiet, the meaning hanging in the air like the scent of the fire. She kissed the tops of their heads before sending them to the loft. The lumberjack was by the window, looking out at the night. Snow drifted down slow and soundless. He turned when she came near. "You know," he said, "there's more than one way to make a family." Her breath caught. She waited for him to go on, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for something on the sill, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it in her hands. Inside was a length of soft green yarn, half knit into a scarf. "You'll need this when the thaw comes," he said. "And maybe longer." Her fingers tightened around it. "Why give it to me now?" "Because I don't want you wondering if I mean to keep you." His voice was steady, without flourish. "I do." For a moment she could only stare at him, the room blurring at the edges. "You know I can't." "I know," he said. "I've known. And I reckon it doesn't matter to me. You've been mother to my children every day since you walked through that door. I don't see how you could give me more than that." Her knees went weak, and she gripped the edge of the table. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that the heat from him brushed her skin. "You belong here," he said again, the same words he'd spoken weeks before, but now they carried the weight of something unshakable. She found herself nodding before her mind caught up to her heart. "Then I'll stay." The smallest smile touched his mouth. "Good." The days that followed felt different, lighter, though nothing in the work had changed. She rose before the children to tend the fire. He returned from the woods with snow in his beard and a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. At night they shared the silence between them like something earned, not endured. On the first day the sun broke through after a long stretch of gray, they planted a young pine just beyond the porch. The boy patted the soil down with mittened hands, the girl arranging a ring of small stones around its base. "It'll grow forever," the boy declared. "Like us," the girl added. She met the lumberjack's gaze over their heads. His expression was steady, but there was a warmth there that made her chest ache. That night, snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. The cabin glowed against the dark, the fire crackling low. She sat by the window, the scarf in her lap, needles clicking softly. The children's laughter floated down from the loft, mingling with the steady rhythm of his steps across the floor. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, far-off howl of the wilderness she had once thought would claim her. But she no longer feared it. The sound only made the cabin feel warmer. She looked toward the pine, its small shape half buried already in white. And for the first time since she could remember, she let herself believe that spring would find her here.